I'm Karen Biondo. I live on a little island in the Puget Sound of Washington, and I'm a farmer and an artist. And Valerie Solanas was my dear favorite and only aunt.
So can you tell us what you remember about Valerie?
Mm. What I remember of Valerie is she was very funny. And as a kid, I just thought she was funny, and she was very sarcastic, and she always had, I guess now we would call it black humor, very dark humor. She made fun of anything and anybody. And I also remember that she gave me books when I was a kid. It was the only thing she ever gave me was books. And sometimes we would read together. And she would go to the beach with us sometimes when she was not on some street in either San Francisco or New York City. And I do have one photograph of Valerie, myself, my mom, and my grandmom in Atlantic City, where we would spend our summers. She was part of my life until I was maybe 11, 12, 13. And then I think as she got more and more off her own rails, she became less visible to us as family.
Can you say more about what off her own rails means?
Yeah. Valerie was wicked intelligent. And I also think this is great in hindsight. I also believe she was ahead of her time politically. Her whole thing about SCUM, I she wrote that in 65, I think, 65, 68, somewhere in there. And the idea that we could function in the world without men was probably really earth-shattering news to the rest of the world. And she didn't believe in work, so to speak. She was a writer, and she wrote for the Village Voice. And as far as her going off the rails, I didn't really know that part of her until I was much older. But she would do things like work on the street. To her, it was a completely legitimate job to panhandle. She called my mom one day from San Francisco. Mom was in Maryland, or where, no, mom might have been in Florida. And she said, "Guess what, Judy, I got a job." And my mom was very excited because mom pretty much financially supported Valerie. And so Valerie was very excited to report that she had a job. She could work her own hours. She said, "I can knock off," those were her words, "I can knock off whenever I want to. This gives me lots of time to write." And mom said, "Great, what are you doing?" And Valerie said, "I'm panhandling. Isn't that awesome?" I'm sure it wasn't awesome in those days. That wasn't the word. But anyway, that was, she was very happy to be a panhandler. And then she started saying things to both me and mom. Mom and Valerie were very, very close. Mom tracked on Valerie all the time. She always knew where Valerie was. She was always sending her money. Sometimes Valerie would ask for a ticket to come visit mom, or mom would go visit Valerie wherever she was. And Valerie smoked. And I remember when mom would ask Valerie for cigarettes. Can I hand me your phone for a second? Mom would hand her a pack of cigarettes and shake one out, and Valerie would take the cigarette, and then she would take the case and say, "There's a microphone in there. I know they're listening to me. They're trying to get me." And then she'd hand the phone back. So that was one of the signs that she was becoming more and more paranoid. I don't know when she was actually diagnosed as paranoid, schizophrenic, delusional. She had all of that.
How did your family talk about Valerie to you?
Ha! My grandmother never talked about her, ever. And she kind of forbade anybody to talk about Valerie. if Valerie was. I don't actually know, other than that picture on the beach with my grandmother, Valerie, and me, I don't know what my grandmother's interaction was with Valerie. But mom and Valerie were very close. And uh, I was close to Valerie up until like I said, until I was about 13. But mom was 2 years younger than Valerie. And and they both went to Catholic school. So mom was always 2 years behind Valerie, who was wicked smart and um, also very belligerent as a Catholic schoolgirl. So Valerie was always getting into trouble. Mom describes herself as a chubby little blonde haired girl, and Valerie would beat up anybody who tried to pick on my mom, Judy. So they had a very tight relationship. And I mean, that was the family. Then there was Linda. Valerie had this daughter. How much of this do you know?
No.
So Valerie had a child out of wedlock. And this all came up when Mary Harron directed the film I Shot Andy Warhol. I got a call when I was living in Seattle from Mary Harron, and long story short, Mary Harron asked me, did Valerie have any children? And I said, no, not that I know of. And so I called my mom and said, did Valerie have any children? And my mom said, no. And then I called my grandmother, and my grandmother said, why are you asking? And I said, because somebody asked me. No, Valerie did not have children. So I called Mary Harron back, and this is when I discovered just how deep the secrets and lies of our family went. And I called Mary Harron calls and says, are you sure? I called mom back and I said, are you sure? And then Mary Harron said to me, well, I have a birth certificate. And I called mom back, and mom said, yeah, she had a daughter. And that daughter is your Aunt Valerie, who turns out she's not my aunt, she's my cousin. So, what was the question?
What your family thought about
Valerie. How they reacted to Valerie. So, my grandmother chose, I believe, to say that Valerie was an artist and just off doing her artistic thing. My grandmother was the queen of denial and burying things. And mom was a little more willing to talk about Valerie, but they never told me she died until I called home one day. I called my mom. I was in San Diego. Mom was living in Florida, just chat. And I said, so how's Valerie? And mom said, oh, she died last year. And I said, well, I would have liked to have known that. Well, we didn't want to worry you. But that's a whole family dynamic that rang true.
Do you remember like the first time that you read Valerie's work, and what did you think?
I didn't read her work until Valerie was gone like 10 years. Let's see, 90, she died in 88. I think mom sent me a copy of, at that time it was called Up Your Ass, or Young Girls Primer to the Leisure Class, or the big Suck or the Big Slime or something like that. And it was a mimeographed copy. And that was the first time I read it. So 10 years after she died. And I did a little performance of like 3 pages of her street scene at a coffee shop in Oregon. Just as a lark, I said, this is pretty funny. So we created a little cabaret scene in a coffee shop, and I read this portion of the play. It was kind of fun. That was the first time I read her work.
Do you remember reading the manifesto?
I didn't read the manifesto until even later beyond that. I guess I kind of grew up in this very white bread, lower middle class, still got to be proper environment. And I didn't know about Valerie's work until I started scratching around for it. It was never offered up to me. And things like college level women, gender, and sexuality curriculums were unavailable at that time.
Do you feel now like connected to her and or connected to her work?
Oh, ever since, yes, ever since, I forget her name, but this woman in Albania contacted me about 4 years ago. This is the first person who requested a legitimate copyright permission. And she was in Albania, and she was writing a compilation of lesser known radical feminists. And she called me and offered to pay me for permission. And so then she sent me this little orange book, the SCUM Manifesto. No, I'm sorry, that was Up Your Ass. She compiled Up Your Ass. And that was the first time I read both the play and the manifesto cover to cover. So that's just 4 years ago. I was aware of it in bits and pieces. My mom and I didn't speak for a chunk of time, like 20 years. And then I brought mom to live with me for the last 5 years of her life. And that's when I got to know who Valerie really was. And I've since inherited a lot of her. I've got her hospital records, I've got her letters, some of her letters. Actually, Dr. Wilson has more letters of Valerie's than I do. So there.
Can you tell us more about your mom's relationship with her? You said they're very close. Do you have like any stories that you remember about the two of them?
Oh, the stories that mom used to tell are stories about Valerie being the older protective sister. Mom was short, round, and fuzzy blonde hair, and Valerie was tall and dark. And so mom would tell stories of how Valerie always instigated trouble and mom always got blamed for it. And then Valerie would laugh. And and as Valerie's mental health deteriorated, mom became more and more protective of Valerie in terms of she always tracked on where Valerie was, whereas my grandmother did not. Um, so she always knew where she was. She would take great effort to go visit Valerie wherever she was. She would have Valerie come live with her for short periods of time. And I think in a perfect world, mom would have loved to have Valerie live near or with them, with her, a lot. But Valerie would just pick up one day and say, I got to go. Um, and and so when Valerie, we apparently, even though I wasn't told Valerie died, that Valerie died alone in a boarding house in San Francisco, and she had been dead for about a week or so before the supervisor for the hotel, when the boarding house, went and knocked on the door because she was late in her rent. And mom and my grandmother used to help pay her rent wherever she was living. And that's how she was discovered. Yeah. And then she's buried now in a plot in Virginia where my grandmother is buried.
I visited there
Did
last
you?
summer. Yeah.
Oh,
Lovely.
you went to Valerie's grave?
Mhm.
Oh,
Um, oh, do you know anything about the relationships that Valerie had? I know she lived with a man for a while.
yeah. She had, let's see, how does this go? She had several relationships that she thought maybe she had at least one relationship with a man. She thought it was a love relationship, but it turned out she didn't really want him as a lover. She just wanted him as a friend, and she wanted him to kind of fund her, but not take care of her in the classic man woman kind of way. And then she had, I don't know about the relationships, but she did have these two children. She had Linda, and I, to this day, I do not know who the father of Linda I would love to have that birth certificate because I have my suspicions about who her father was. Do you want me to tell you that on this?
If you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I don't see why not. And this is totally suspicious on my part. My mother and Valerie shared the same father, and his name was it Victor? Solanas. So Solanas is my mom and Valerie's father, married to my grandmother. And my mom did tell me that Solanas abused / raped Valerie several times. And mom was witness to that. Somewhere in there, I believe that Valerie gave birth to Linda, and I believe that Solanas was the father. I have absolutely no proof or evidence of that, but when I just think back to the timeline and how extraordinary Linda's looks were, she looked like a Biondo and a Solanas. She was dark skinned. She and Biondo is our paternal family, and the looks just look like that's who her father was. But I have absolutely no idea, and nobody's telling. They're all dead now. And then Valerie, so she had some relationship there. And then there's this other child, David Blackwell, who was her son. And so she had a relationship with this Blackwell person who apparently was married and in the military. But for whatever reason, my grandmother decided not to adopt him, but she did adopt Linda and completely compromised my mom at the age of 12 by saying to my mom, Valerie is your sister, and you will never tell anybody anything different. So I guess on some level she was her sister, since Solanas, I mean, it's very messed up. But anyway, I mean, Linda is your sister, and you'll never tell anybody anything different. So Linda and I grew up thinking she was my aunt, and she was my 14-year younger sister to my mother. It's very complicated. Anyway, so that's all I really know about Valerie's relationships.
This is a little different now, but how did you feel when you saw the play performed the first time?
Oh my God. So I saw it performed as a musical back in the, I think it might have been the early 90s in San Francisco. Yes. And I loved it. I went with my mom and I loved it. I also didn't really understand that I didn't have the same relationship to that performance as my aunt's work. Because at that time, I had not been introduced much to Valerie since she had died. So I wasn't as familiar with who Valerie was as a radical feminist, what her ambitions were, and who she was as a human later in life. So I just enjoyed the play and thought, wow, that's cool. That's my aunt's work. Then when I went to Belgium and saw a play performed by young people like yourselves, and listening to them talk about Valerie, it's listening to you all talk about Valerie and your interest in her and the subject of who she represents. That has what has made me closer to Valerie than I've been since I was a kid. So I am quite, I don't know, it's just, it seems to be suddenly really important now that she did this work. And so I appreciate who she is now more than I did. I mean, I appreciate her more as a writer and an activist and a feminist more than when I was a kid and she's just my aunt.
From what you remember about her growing up, do you think that there is a difference between who she was as your aunt and as a person than who she was through her writing? or do you think it's very?
I don't think so. I don't think Valerie knew how to be anybody but who she was. And like we were talking about, people's perspectives. My perspective as a young child was she was just my aunt, and she was a little quirky, and I didn't see her much. But I don't think Valerie knew how to be anything other than who she was ever.
How would you explain Valerie to someone who has never heard
Funny you should ask that.
of her?
I used to say that my Aunt Valerie was a crazy woman who shot Andy Warhol. That's what I used to say until about, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. Um, and then I actually became more aware and listened to myself say these things because that's not who I knew. That is what other people projected back to me, the newspaper headlines and all of that. And then I realized that no, Valerie was a brilliant human being, and she was a writer and an activist and funny, and she shot Andy Warhol. And if I look at it from a different angle, she shot Andy Warhol because he led her on, he teased her mercilessly, and he would never produce her work. And he would put her off and put her off and put her off, and she got pissed. So I'm not saying what she did was right, but nonetheless, there it is.
What do you remember about that time when she was friends with Warhol, or that's a complicated way to say
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
but
right.
knew Warhol, and
Yes.
then when she shot him, like what do you remember?
I only remember because she shot him the same year that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Is that right? I think so. Um, and so I was a senior in high school at that time in 72. That's how old I am. I know you weren't even born yet. Nonetheless, I was so caught up in my own little life that it just kind of went past me that, oh, by the way, your aunt's in jail and she shot Andy Warhol. And this really messed up his life for a long time. And again, I didn't become more aware of what that was all about until much later. So at the time, I don't remember anything. It's kind of sad. My mom does, but my mom and I were barely speaking for, a whole nother bunch of reasons. I love it that you've got up your ass sticker on your computer. I want one. Yeah, so that's what I remembered, not very much.
Yeah. That's all I have prepared. Is there anything else that you want to share?
Well, I am so impressed and grateful to all of the work you have done, all of the work that the actors in Belgium and Kenyon College, the idea that Valerie is uh, relevant again. I've never understood what legacy was really until now, that this body of work, even though, not even though, but this body of work is her legacy. And the idea that it will continue on is really, I think, fascinating and wonderful and important. And so thank you for doing the work.
I think it's so interesting that it's now there's been 3
Yeah.
productions in a row. I think that's really
Yeah.
cool. And I'm really excited that people are reading it and hearing about it and actually seeing it being performed.
Yes.
And I think that it speaks to the fact that it's extremely relevant. It's like it could have been written yesterday.
Yes.
It's, you know, it's so incredible. And I think that it's gonna grow, and I think this is just the beginning of people coming back to Valerie
Aw, yeah,
and learning about her.
yeah.
And I think like feminism now is ready for something radical.
Yes.
And I think that that might start with this work.
Yeah. Oh, I wish Mom were still alive. She died just 3 years ago, and she would have loved to have been part of this. And she's the one who held so many memories. And I wish that I had more personal memories of Valerie. But I have what I have. And I have a lot of what I have because of you. So, oh.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
doing this.